His own son looked him in the eyes and said, "You're just a burden, Dad." What the young entrepreneur didn't know was that his quiet father, Albert Korvik, secretly earned $680,000 a year and was about to uncover a ruthless scheme designed to steal everything his son had built. Can Albert save his son before it's too late? Watch until the end, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. You're just a burden, Dad. The words landed harder than the clatter of silverware or the quiet conversations filling the restaurant. Every sound around us seemed to fade for a moment. I looked across the table at my son, Nolan, waiting for him to smile and admit he had gone too far. He didn't. His face remained calm, almost cold, as though he had rehearsed that sentence long before saying it out loud. A woman at the next table glanced toward us before pretending to focus on her meal. A waiter slowed his pace, unsure whether to approach or walk away. Even a couple sitting near the window stopped talking for a few seconds. I simply stared at my son, not because he had insulted me, because I couldn't recognize the person saying those words. My name is Albert Korvik. I'm 52 years old, and if someone judged me only by my appearance, they would probably assume I struggled to pay my bills. My pickup truck is nearly 15 years old. Most of my shirts come from ordinary department stores. I wear the same watch I've owned for over a decade because it still works perfectly. I never cared about expensive suits, luxury watches, or flashy cars. People often mistake simplicity for failure. I've learned not to correct them. For nearly 20 years, I have worked as an independent cybersecurity consultant. My clients are multinational corporations that call me after catastrophic cyber attacks threaten to destroy years of work. They don't hire me because I'm famous. They hire me because I solve problems quietly, efficiently, and without attracting attention. Last year alone, my income reached $680,000. Almost nobody knew that, especially not my own son. That wasn't an accident. Years ago, I made a decision that shaped the way I lived. After watching relatives tear each other apart over inheritances and business profits, I promised myself that any child of mine would grow up respecting people instead of bank accounts. I wanted Nolan to build his own future without expecting shortcuts because of my success. For a long time, I believed that decision had worked. Looking back now, I realize I only hid one truth while leaving another door wide open. 3 months earlier, everything between Nolan and me had seemed perfectly normal. He had invited me to tour the office of his new artificial intelligence startup, and I remember feeling proud before I even walked through the entrance. The building had once been an old warehouse before developers transformed it into a modern workspace filled with glass conference rooms, polished concrete floors, and rows of adjustable desks covered with computer monitors. Young engineers hurried from meeting to meeting carrying laptops and coffee cups. Whiteboards overflowed with diagrams and handwritten ideas. Every corner reflected energy and ambition. Nolan fit naturally into that environment. He greeted employees by name. They respected him. Investors had begun requesting meetings, and several technology blogs had already written positive articles about his company. Watching him speak with confidence reminded me of the determination he had shown as a teenager when he dismantled old computers in our garage just to understand how every component worked. At that moment, I believed my greatest responsibility as a father had already been fulfilled. I was wrong. During that visit, Nolan introduced me to someone I had never met before. "Dad," he said with a smile, "this is Damien Voss. He's been helping us prepare for rapid growth." Damien extended his hand before I could answer. His handshake was firm without trying too hard. His suit was expensive but understated. Everything about him suggested confidence that had been carefully practiced for years. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Korvik," he said. "Nolan speaks highly of you." His words sounded polite. His eyes told a different story. For only a fraction of a second, I noticed him studying my worn jacket, my old boots, and the truck keys resting in my hand. Then the smile returned. Most people would have missed that tiny change. I didn't. Years spent negotiating with executives after billion-dollar cyber disasters had taught me to notice details others ignored. Real intentions often appeared for only a heartbeat before disappearing behind professional manners. Still, I pushed the thought aside. Not everyone makes a good first impression. As Nolan proudly showed me around the office, I noticed something else. Whenever employees had questions, they often looked toward Damien before looking at Nolan. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet it happened again and again. That wasn't how mentors usually behaved. That was how leaders quietly established authority without holding the official title. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, Nolan was successful. His company was growing. He seemed happy. Sometimes fathers imagine danger simply because they don't want to admit their children no longer need them. I hoped that was all this feeling was. I had no idea that the man smiling beside my son wasn't preparing him for success. He was preparing to take everything away from him. The uneasy feeling I had during that office visit refused to disappear. For the next several weeks, Nolan called me less often than he used to. That alone wasn't unusual. His company was expanding quickly, new clients were signing contracts, and investors constantly demanded updates. I understood the pressure because I had spent decades working under impossible deadlines myself. Still, something about the silence felt different. Whenever I did manage to reach him, our conversations became strangely short. "I'm busy, Dad. I'll call you later. We're in the middle of something." Those sentences replaced the long discussions we once shared about technology, business, and life. One Tuesday afternoon, I decided to stop by his office with lunch. Nolan had always loved the roast beef sandwiches from a small family-owned deli near my house. It had become a tradition ever since he was in high school. Whenever he faced an important exam or project, I would bring him one. Some traditions deserve to survive adulthood. When I entered the building, the atmosphere immediately felt different from my previous visit. Employees were speaking in lower voices. Several conference rooms had their blinds closed. Damien stood near the reception desk talking to two investors, while Nolan listened quietly beside him. The moment Damien noticed me, his polished smile appeared. "Albert," he said warmly. "What a pleasant surprise. I brought Nolan some lunch." Before Nolan could answer, Damien spoke first. "We've actually ordered catering today. You didn't have to trouble yourself." His tone remained perfectly polite, yet it somehow made me feel like an outsider. Nolan accepted the paper bag anyway. "Thanks, Dad." That was all he said. No hug, no excitement. Just 2 words before Damien smoothly redirected the conversation toward the investors. I decided not to interrupt. Instead, I wandered through the open workspace while waiting for Nolan to finish. A few employees smiled politely. Others barely looked up from their screens. Then I noticed something curious. On a large digital display mounted against the wall, the company's organizational chart had recently been updated. Nolan's name remained at the top as CEO, but Damien's title caught my attention. Executive Strategic Advisor. The title itself wasn't unusual. The influence attached to it was. Every major department appeared connected directly to Damien through advisory committees. Marketing, finance, operations, investor relations, even hiring recommendations. For someone who officially wasn't an executive, he occupied an astonishing amount of space inside the company's structure. That wasn't mentoring. That was positioning. Before I could think further, Nolan approached me carrying the untouched lunch bag. "Want to grab coffee downstairs?" he asked. I smiled. Of course. For the first few minutes, everything felt almost normal. We talked about a recent cybersecurity attack that had made international headlines. Nolan asked technical questions like he always had, and I enjoyed explaining how attackers often exploited human trust more effectively than software vulnerabilities. Then the conversation shifted. "You know," Nolan said while stirring his coffee, "Damien thinks modern businesses move too fast for old-school leadership." I looked at him carefully. "What does that mean?" He says emotional decisions slow companies down. "I agree they can," I replied. "But removing empathy entirely creates different problems." Nolan shrugged. He believes successful founders have to cut away anything that drains their focus. "Anything?" He nodded. "Negative influences. Unproductive relationships. People who depend on you too much." The words sounded oddly rehearsed, almost memorized. I leaned back in my chair. "And, do you agree with him?" Nolan hesitated for only a second, I think he has a point. I changed the subject because arguing would accomplish nothing. But something inside me tightened. Those weren't simply Damien's opinions anymore. They were becoming Nolan's. Over the following month, I noticed more changes. Family dinners became rare. Weekend visits disappeared. Whenever I invited Nolan over, he claimed another investor meeting had appeared on his calendar. At first, I believed him. Then I realized something. His social media accounts showed photos from networking events that took place after the times he claimed to be working. He wasn't too busy. He simply wasn't making time for me anymore. One Friday evening, I arrived home after finishing a remote security audit for a European manufacturing company. The project had required nearly 70 hours of work across multiple time zones, but it ended successfully. My client transferred the final payment that afternoon, another substantial contract completed quietly, without recognition. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, my phone rang. It was Nolan. For a brief moment, I smiled. Maybe things were returning to normal. Instead, he said, "Dad, can you meet me for dinner tomorrow night? Damien will be there too." Something in his voice sounded unusually formal, almost rehearsed. I accepted immediately. I didn't know that the dinner he had arranged wasn't meant to bring us together. It was carefully designed to push us further apart than we had ever been. The restaurant Damien selected overlooked the river on the east side of the city. It wasn't the kind of place I normally visited, but I had attended enough corporate dinners to know exactly why people liked it. The lighting was soft, the service was quiet, and every table offered enough privacy for conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. When I arrived, Nolan and Damien were already seated. Nolan stood and shook my hand. Damien smiled, as though we were old friends. "Albert," he said, "glad you could make it." I nodded and sat across from them. For the first several minutes, everything felt surprisingly pleasant. We discussed technology trends, rising cybersecurity threats, and the rapid growth of artificial intelligence. Damien spoke confidently, quoting market reports and investment forecasts with impressive precision. I understood why people admired him. He always sounded like the smartest person in the room. The waiter poured water into our glasses before taking our orders. Once he walked away, Damien casually leaned back in his chair. "Nolan has built something extraordinary," he said. "I agree," I replied. "He's worked hard for it." Damien smiled. "Success like this requires difficult choices." I looked at him. What kind of choices? The ability to separate opportunity from obligation. His answer was vague enough to sound wise without saying anything specific. I had met people like that before. Consultants, executives, professional negotiators. They often used broad statements because listeners filled in the meaning themselves. Nolan nodded as though he had heard those words many times. Damien continued, "Many founders fail because they allow unnecessary responsibilities to distract them." I folded my hands on the table. Responsibilities usually exist for a reason. They do, Damien answered calmly. But not every responsibility deserves equal attention. The food arrived before either of us spoke again. For several minutes, we focused on eating. Then Damien asked a question that seemed innocent. "Albert, have you ever considered retiring?" I smiled slightly. "Not really." "Why not?" "I enjoy solving problems." He tilted his head. "But eventually people slow down." "Some do." "Nolan's entering the busiest years of his career. He'll have less time for family obligations." I noticed he never looked directly at Nolan while saying those words. He watched me instead, testing my reaction. "I don't expect my son to organize his life around me," I answered. "That's healthy," Damien said. "Some parents aren't able to let go." Nolan quietly sipped his drink. He didn't interrupt. That silence concerned me more than Damien's comments. The conversation drifted toward business again, but every topic somehow returned to the same message. Efficiency, sacrifice, eliminating distractions, removing emotional weight. None of those ideas sounded dangerous on their own. Together, they formed a philosophy that left very little room for loyalty. As dinner continued, Nolan excused himself to answer a phone call from one of his engineers. The moment he disappeared toward the entrance, Damien rested his elbows on the table. "You raised an intelligent son," he said. "I'm proud of him." "You should be." His smile remained perfectly controlled. But intelligence sometimes requires distance. I waited. He continued, "Nolan has enormous potential. My job is making sure nothing limits it." "What exactly do you mean by nothing?" He met my eyes without blinking. People often cling to familiar relationships because they fear change. And successful entrepreneurs eventually realize that not everyone can accompany them to the next stage. There it was. Not an accusation, not a threat, a carefully planted suggestion. One designed to sound reasonable. Before I could respond, Nolan returned and sat down. Damien instantly shifted topics as though nothing unusual had happened. The rest of dinner passed with polite conversation until dessert arrived. Then Nolan placed his fork on the plate and looked directly at me. "Dad," he began quietly, "there's something I've been thinking about." I nodded. "Go ahead." He inhaled slowly. "I feel like sometimes you don't understand where my life is heading." "I've tried to understand." "I know." His voice grew firmer. "But every time we talk, it feels like you're questioning the people helping me grow." I glanced toward Damien. He remained silent, almost invisible, exactly where he wanted to be. "I'm questioning situations," I said, "not your success." Nolan shook his head.
"No, Dad."
"You're questioning my judgment. I've only asked questions because I care." He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Maybe that's the problem. The sentence caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He looked down at the table for several seconds before raising his eyes again. Everything about his expression had changed. It was colder, more certain, as though someone had spent months convincing him that compassion was weakness. Then he said the sentence that froze every conversation around us. "You're just a burden, Dad." For several seconds, nobody moved. Not me, not Nolan, not even Damien. But as I looked at Damien's face, I noticed something almost impossible to detect. The corner of his mouth lifted for less than a second. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't discomfort. It was satisfaction. And in that single moment, I realized this dinner had never been about sharing a meal. It had been carefully arranged to make my own son reject me in public. I didn't answer immediately. Anger would have been easy. Defending myself would have been natural. Instead, I quietly reached for my wallet, placed enough cash on the table to cover my meal, and stood up. "I hope you both have a good evening," I said. Nolan looked surprised. Perhaps he expected an argument. Perhaps Damien did too. Neither of them got one. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel dozens of eyes following me. The waiter held the front door open without saying a word. Outside, the cool night air felt strangely peaceful compared to the tension I had just left behind. I sat inside my old pickup truck for several minutes before starting the engine. The sentence kept replaying in my mind. "You're just a burden, Dad." It hurt, not because my son had questioned my worth. It hurt because I knew those words didn't belong to him.
Someone had planted them.
The next morning I woke before sunrise, made a pot of coffee, and opened my laptop. Normally, Saturdays were reserved for rest, but concentration came easier than emotion. I buried myself in a cybersecurity assessment for a pharmaceutical company based in Switzerland. By noon, I had already identified 2 major vulnerabilities their internal team had overlooked. Work had always been my way of thinking clearly. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated. It was an email notification from one of my long-term corporate clients. The subject line read, "Emergency Incident Response Required." A manufacturing company operating across 3 countries had suffered a coordinated ransomware attack. Their production systems were offline, and every hour of downtime was costing millions of dollars. I accepted the assignment immediately. Within an hour, I was participating in encrypted video conferences with executives, legal advisors, and security engineers spread across different time zones. For the next 4 days, I barely slept. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could multiply the damage. By the end of the operation, we successfully isolated the attackers before they reached the company's financial infrastructure. Another crisis solved. Another confidential contract completed. The final payment arrived the following morning, just over $200,000. As always, The money entered my business account quietly, without celebration or public recognition. No luxury purchases followed. No expensive vacations. I simply moved on to the next responsibility. Late that evening, I decided to stop by Nolan's office without announcing my visit. Not to argue, not to apologize. I only wanted to see him face to face after giving both of us time to cool down. The building remained brightly lit despite the late hour. Most employees had already gone home. As I entered the lobby, the receptionist politely informed me that Nolan was still upstairs in a strategy meeting. "I'll wait," I replied. She offered coffee, but I declined. Instead, I wandered toward a hallway lined with framed photographs showing the company's milestones. Early team meetings, product launches, investor presentations. Damien appeared in nearly every recent picture. The closer the company came to success, the more visible he became. After several minutes, I heard voices coming from a conference room at the end of the corridor. The door wasn't fully closed. I recognized Damien's voice immediately. He still trusts people too easily. Another man answered through what sounded like a speakerphone. "Will he sign?" "He will," Damien replied confidently. "He's almost completely dependent on my advice now." My pulse slowed. Years of incident response had taught me something valuable. When danger appears, emotions become distractions. Information becomes everything. I quietly stepped closer. "He keeps asking about ownership percentages," Damien continued. "But once the restructuring documents are finalized, controlling shares transfer automatically through the holding company." The voice on the speaker laughed. "And the father?" A brief pause followed. "The father almost caused problems," Damien admitted. "Fortunately, Nolan already believes he's outdated. After what happened at dinner, I doubt he'll listen to anything Albert says again." Every word confirmed my worst suspicion. This had never been about mentorship. It was a takeover, carefully planned, patiently executed. Without making a sound, I slipped my phone from my pocket and opened the voice recorder. I captured every second I could without risking discovery. For nearly 6 minutes, Damien explained hidden investment structures, offshore holding companies, and the exact timeline for convincing Nolan to surrender operational control while believing he was attracting new capital. The recording ended only because footsteps echoed from another hallway. I immediately locked my phone, turned around, and walked calmly toward the elevators before anyone noticed I had been standing outside that room. Inside the elevator, I finally allowed myself one deep breath. I now possessed something more valuable than suspicion. I had evidence, but I also knew one uncomfortable truth. People willing to steal an entire company would do almost anything to protect their plan. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that Damien already suspected someone had been listening. I barely slept that night. The recording on my phone confirmed everything I had feared, but experience had taught me that evidence and proof were not the same thing. In my profession, assumptions could destroy reputations, while verified facts could stop billion-dollar disasters. If I wanted to protect Nolan, I needed more than 6 minutes of recorded conversation. The next morning, I copied the audio file onto an encrypted flash drive before leaving my house. It was an old habit developed after years of handling confidential corporate investigations. Never trust a single copy. Never assume important evidence will remain where you left it. I planned to meet an attorney later that afternoon. I never got the chance. Around noon, I stopped at a small hotel near the airport where I often rented a room between consulting assignments. It gave me a quiet place to work without interruptions whenever clients required complete confidentiality. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Welcome back, Mr. Korvik." I smiled politely, collected my room key, and headed upstairs. Everything looked normal. The bed was neatly made. The curtains were still closed. My laptop sat exactly where I had left it. Nothing appeared out of place. Then I noticed the drawer beside the bed. It was open by less than an inch. I was certain I had closed it before leaving. Years of cybersecurity had trained me to notice tiny inconsistencies. Digital attackers left traces inside computer logs. Physical intruders left traces inside ordinary rooms. Without touching anything else, I slowly inspected the room. No broken lock. No shattered window. No signs of forced entry. Professional. I opened the drawer. Empty. My spare phone was gone. Fortunately, it wasn't the device containing Damien's recording. That phone remained inside the locked compartment of my pickup truck downstairs. Whoever entered my room had searched for information. They simply chose the wrong device. Instead of calling the police immediately, I walked back to the lobby and requested security footage. The hotel manager apologized. Our camera system stopped recording for nearly 40 minutes this morning because of a network failure. A network failure. The timing was almost laughable. Someone had either disabled the cameras or knew exactly when they would be unavailable. Neither possibility made me comfortable. As I left the hotel, a black SUV parked across the street slowly pulled away. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe it wasn't. I wrote down part of the license plate anyway. Evidence begins with details. Driving home, I realized I couldn't investigate Damien alone anymore. He wasn't simply manipulating Nolan emotionally. He had resources, planning, and apparently people willing to take risks to protect him. I needed someone whose expertise complemented my own. That evening I called an old professional acquaintance I hadn't spoken with in nearly 3 years. Her name was Seraphine Quill. She wasn't a police detective. She wasn't a private investigator. She was one of the best forensic accountants I had ever worked with. While I traced digital attacks, Seraphine followed money. And money almost never lied. We met the following morning inside a quiet cafe several miles outside the financial district. Seraphine arrived carrying nothing except a leather notebook and a tablet computer. She greeted me with a firm handshake. "You only call when something is serious," she said. "It is." I explained everything from the dinner confrontation to the hidden conversation outside the conference room. She listened without interrupting. Only after hearing the recording did she speak again. "This isn't an emotional manipulation case," she said calmly. "It's a financial acquisition strategy." I reached the same conclusion. She nodded. "The recording gives us direction, not victory. If Damien is using shell companies, we need corporate filings, ownership records, investment agreements, and banking connections. Can you find them?" A slight smile crossed her face. "I've spent 25 years finding things people believed were impossible to connect." For the next week, Seraphine worked while I continued handling consulting contracts to avoid attracting attention. We communicated only through encrypted messages. Then, exactly 8 days later, she asked me to meet her again. This time, she didn't smile. She placed a thick folder on the table. "You were right to be worried." I opened the first page. 5 company names were highlighted. Different industries, different states, different founders. At first glance, they seemed completely unrelated. Then Seraphine pointed toward a column listing beneficial ownership. Every trail eventually led to the same network of holding companies. Every network led back to Damien Voss. "He didn't mentor these founders," she said quietly. "He emptied them out. One after another, ambitious young entrepreneurs had lost control of businesses they believed they still owned. Their investors disappeared. Their voting rights vanished. Their companies collapsed while Damien quietly walked away with valuable assets hidden behind layers of legal paperwork." I closed the folder slowly. If Nolan signed the documents Damien was preparing, my son wouldn't simply lose money. He would lose the company he had spent years building. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized we were running out of time. The folder Seraphine placed in front of me felt heavier than its actual weight. Not because of the paper inside, because every page represented someone whose dream had been carefully dismantled. I opened the first file. The founder was 28 years old when he launched a renewable energy startup. Investors praised his vision. The media celebrated his rapid growth, and within 2 years his company was worth tens of millions of dollars. Then Damien Voss appeared as a strategic advisor. 6 months later, the founder no longer controlled his own business. According to the documents, he had unknowingly signed revised shareholder agreements during what Damien described as a routine investment restructuring. Hidden among dozens of legal pages were clauses transferring voting rights to a holding company registered overseas. The founder didn't realize what had happened until the board voted him out. I turned to the second file. The pattern repeated almost perfectly. Different company,
Different industry.
Different city. The same outcome. A charismatic mentor arrived. Confidence grew. Outside advisors disappeared one by one. Complex legal paperwork followed. Ownership quietly changed hands. The founder was removed. Then Damien moved on to another ambitious entrepreneur. "This isn't coincidence," I said. Seraphine nodded. "It's a business model." She opened her tablet and displayed a network diagram connecting shell corporations across 3 countries. "These companies don't appear related at first glance," she explained. "Different names, different directors, different addresses. But when you trace beneficial ownership through corporate filings, every road eventually leads back to Damien." I studied the diagram carefully. It looked less like a business structure and more like a carefully designed trap. "What about criminal investigations?" I asked. "There were complaints," Seraphine replied. "None succeeded." "Why?" "Because every victim believed they had voluntarily signed the contracts." That answer frustrated me more than I expected. Damien wasn't relying on forged signatures. He relied on trust. He convinced talented founders that he was helping them grow until they stopped questioning his advice. By the time they understood the truth, every document had already been legally executed. Seraphine slid another document across the table. "This one concerns Nolan." I immediately looked up. "You found something already?" "Not a signed agreement," she answered. "A draft." My heart began beating faster. The document carried Nolan's company logo along with the title, Strategic Capital Expansion Framework. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. Projected revenue, investment milestones, governance updates, board restructuring. Then Seraphine highlighted a paragraph near the end. "Read this section carefully." I leaned closer. Buried inside dense legal language was a clause authorizing temporary voting authority to an affiliated investment management entity during future financing rounds. Temporary. The word appeared harmless. The attached conditions were not. "What happens if Nolan signs this?" I asked. "He loses operational control before realizing it. Can it be reversed?" "Only through expensive litigation." I leaned back in my chair. Damien wasn't planning to steal the company overnight. He intended to make every step appear completely legitimate. That made him far more dangerous than an ordinary fraudster. As we continued reviewing the evidence, Seraphine noticed something unusual buried inside financial records connected to one of Damien's previous shell companies. She enlarged the screen. This transfer happened 4 days ago. Several $1 million had moved between 2 corporate entities before disappearing into another investment account. The destination company had been incorporated only 3 weeks earlier. Its registered business purpose sounded vague enough to avoid attention. Technology Development Holdings. What does that tell us? I asked. She looked at me seriously. It tells us Damien is preparing for another acquisition. I didn't need to ask whose company he intended to acquire. Before leaving the cafe, we agreed on a plan. I would not confront Nolan. Not yet. If Damien realized we understood his strategy, he would simply accelerate his timetable or destroy evidence before authorities could examine it. Instead, Seraphine would continue tracing financial records while I monitored developments around Nolan's company. We needed proof that connected Damien's hidden corporations directly to the contract waiting for Nolan's signature. Without that connection, everything remained circumstantial. That evening, I drove toward Nolan's office but stopped across the street instead of going inside. Employees gradually left the building as darkness settled over the city. At nearly 8 o'clock, Damien finally emerged carrying a leather briefcase. He wasn't alone. A man I had never seen before handed him a thick envelope before both of them entered separate vehicles and drove away in opposite directions. The exchange lasted less than 20 seconds. No handshake, no conversation, just an envelope. Every instinct I had developed over decades told me that whatever had changed hands was important. I reached for my phone, took several photographs from inside my truck, and watched Damien disappear into traffic. For the first time since this began, I stopped thinking like a father trying to save his son. I started thinking like an investigator building a case. And I had a feeling Damien Voss had just made the first mistake that would eventually bring his entire operation crashing down.